Chris, we've heard around the topic of failure fairs that sometimes the concept of failure fairs or sharing failures works very well from a bottom-up perspective, that you can build a lot of momentum across the organization in a very organic way to start talking about failures. But then you become a bit of a victim of success of failure fairs, because as they start to become more popular or more successful and the senior executive community starts to become involved, then people become less comfortable sharing failures, and it changes the dynamic. So can you talk, Chris, a little bit about your experience involving senior executives in sharing failures and how that's worked at UNICEF or some of the other network organizations that you're involved with?
Yeah, thanks, Sue. It's a good question. I think it goes back also to the last question, which is they really don't like it. And I would reflect on one of our senior managers last year who said, of course it's okay to talk about failures and have things fail as long as they succeed in the end, which I think is really the way that a lot of this stuff is set up. But I think to the point that we heard earlier, like, it may be that we're also using a little bit of wrong language at this point. And I think depending on how mature an organization is, we can start to get into a much better discussion about learning and organizational positioning, where maybe the word failure starts to mean a very specific set of things. And I think about it a little bit in the same way as the word innovation, which is a very dangerous word. I mean, it sort of doesn't mean anything and it means everything to everybody. So as we're talking to our senior management team and sort of thinking through things, we're trying to position words like learning and organizational adaptability, where of course you have to take these steps that don't work at first. And something about that starts to become more palatable. Now, I think UNICEF is actually an organization that doesn't even talk well about its successes most of the time. So, our ability to celebrate failures is kind of questionable as well. But I also think that having prompts from external parties, like when Denmark came to us recently and said to us that our donor report back to them was a failure because it had no failures in it, and they had invested in us as a team that was supposed to fail, that was very encouraging, because having the external party say that sort of gives us a little bit of space to go back and really rethink how we do that donor report. So those would be my sort of reflections. One is sort of reframing things a bit, and the other is really thinking about how we can get external support and push on our senior team so that they feel comfortable in this space of failure and learning.
Great, thanks, Chris. And am I right that the failure expectation on that side of your business is set at about 90%?
That is what we have in our innovation fund. We have for our investors and donors a notional figure of 90% failure. Nobody's ever really asked us to say what that means. So it's something we put in there. And at first the thinking was that 90% of the projects we would invest in would fail, which would mean that out of a $15 million fund, we would have really only about 5 working projects. That hasn't been the case. So we've had actually a much lower failure rate than that. So we're trying to think about what we meant when we said that, but that is what everybody signed off on. And that's also given us some space to be creative about our failures.
Really interesting. Thanks, Chris. Ben, could I ask you a similar question? I'm wondering what it's like working in a large organization like UNDP and thinking about the concept in the innovation space around, testing and experimenting and failing fast, but then at the same time having certain types of experiments being championed by senior executives who might not want to let them fail. So could you talk a little bit about the culture around failure and, how this has an impact on, the involvement of senior executives?
Sure, happy to. In UNDP, we actually learned that failure isn't the right concept to advance the discourse we want to advance in the organization. We, back in 2014, tried sourcing stories for the same supporter for Denmark on failure, and even the most open-minded country-level innovators were super hesitant of sharing failure stories. I personally think there's a certain fetish around failure in the innovation community, and I think we focusing about learning and acknowledging, of course, like operational failures are better advised. But personally and as a team, we are pushing a conversation on learning and quick learning. And Sue, to your earlier question, I think for us it's also important, you know, as development practitioners and activists, to distinguish between a failure. Let's think of Uganda, like a system not designed by any UN agency, but by a huge private sector company, an NGO, to inform young people about reproductive rights and actually sex. That led, and the only university randomized control trial found that out, to more new infections of HIV/AIDS. I mean, here we're talking about a failure of innovation that has severe impact on human lives, and that's nothing to kind of present in a fun failure fair. So I think it's important for us to kind of think about what kind of failure do we present in a certain context and in a certain tone, and what kind of failures we got to talk seriously about. And all of our agencies probably have some of the degree that I just mentioned. So in a nutshell, we dropped the whole concept of failure as a terminology to push in our innovation context, and are really focusing on learning. And what we are pushing is to think about what I said, you know, scaling processes and accelerated learning. We are now putting together a new proposal for a really large innovation component that is, in my view, quite bold, because it presents to donors learning almost at the same level as results. We ask the donors to invest in accelerated learnings on what works for SDG achievement efforts, in addition to results. Let's see how it goes, but we have good indication from a number of donors. And to sum up, that's what we are continuing to do. Less talk about failure, much more focus about learning.